Hi everyone, it's William. This is part 7 of my YouTube series Death in Literature, and I was planning on doing The Turn of the Screw today and as a short one, but as it turned out, I wanted to reread the ending, but I couldn't find my copy, so I went and bought an ebook on Amazon. And it's such a short book. I thought, well, I'm just going to read the whole thing. And then I was really glad I did. I haven't read it for a while. It's fantastic. So I'm about 70% through it at the moment. And I didn't want to wait until I finished it because I've already skipped one day without a video. So I decided in the interim to do a book that is somewhat related. So we have some diabolical children. In fact, the title of the book is Les Enfants Terribles, or in translation, The Terrible Children. And it's by Jean Cocteau, and it's not a book that's really in the repertoire anywhere, in the canon, so to speak. So you kind of have to go looking for it. And the reason I went looking for it is, you may have figured out by now, in addition to being a lover of literature, I'm also a cinephile, and I had enjoyed some of Cocteau's more well-known films, and so I was looking at his filmography, and when I saw that he'd done this one, I decided, and that it was based on a novel that he had written, I decided to read the novel, and I'm dying to see the film, but it just doesn't seem to be available anywhere. I didn't look hard enough when I was in France last March. There go the dogs. But I'm still dying to see the film. I mean, Cocteau was probably a better filmmaker than a writer, although the writing in this book is beautiful. It's gorgeous. I highly recommend it. Look for it. You can find it both in French and in English on Amazon. But it's quite apparent to me, as a person writing a novel himself and a lover of literature, that about halfway through the book he got bored. He just got bored. And so he does this ridiculous leap where all kinds of interesting events are just not covered. And all of a sudden you find yourself sort of on terra incognita. So the book is about a brother and sister. They are the terrible children, and they have been woefully neglected and exposed to things that they shouldn't have been exposed to. Their father was violent, either a drug addict or an alcoholic. I think a drug addict, and violent, physically violent person, and he died relatively early, before they were teenagers, and their mother for a while had sort of gone off and just lived a life of hedonism. I don't think she was an addict, I can't remember, and she destroyed her health. And the kids were always sort of left to their own devices. Their names were Paul and Elizabeth, and when she finally, her health was destroyed, she was housebound, she was basically bedbound. The daughter, now a teenager, was taking care of her. So Paul was still going to school, but Elizabeth had taken on this role of being her mother's caregiver. And so her childhood was basically over, and yet she was not mature. Neither of the children were mature. We meet them when they're teenagers, and they've just been on their own for so long, and in the case of Elizabeth, playing an adult role. And, I asked myself as I was reading this, could these children have been saved? They had a wealthy patron. The mother's doctor hires a woman to take care of them, but she's just this sort of uneducated peasant woman, and she's in awe of these kids who are very smart and very creative, and she's just not going to step in. And the doctor pays the bills. He doesn't see them very often, but he pays the bills, and he hires this woman. So there's death in this book in the form of natural causes, but also 2 suicides, and you can probably guess already who kills themselves. This is one of these books where from, about page 10 on, somebody's going to die. There's a situation that's so tense and that it's just going to explode. It's just going to explode, and we'll see how many people die as a result of the explosion. There's an interesting sort of link in this book between death and petrification. So we'll talk about that. That's not one I've really come across before. We think of death and corruption and decay, but death as petrification is, in a figurative sense, that's an interesting link. So other characters in the book, also teenagers, the same age as Paul and Elizabeth: Gerard, Agatha, and Michael. Those are the only ones that Paul and Elizabeth just circle the wagons. They just want to be with each other, but they rarely, but once in a while, they allow people to penetrate to a certain extent into their inner life. One of them is Gerard, who, like them, is an orphan. They become orphans. So I think you've probably already seen how prevalent orphans are in literature. Also in mythology, the orphan can be the hero, or the orphan can go badly wrong without guidance in the more sort of naturalistic books, as is the case with the terrible children. So Gerard is fascinated by them. He was particularly fascinated by Paul. He was going to school with Paul, but then Paul has a heart condition, and eventually he has to leave school and just be at home all the time. Not bedbound, but pretty much just stay at home. Agatha is a model. Elizabeth just happens to be beautiful. So this is another theme. Paul and with children in literature, interesting children, they're often physically just stunning. And that's the case with Paul and Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth decides she wants to go out and get a job, just because it will amuse her, and to spite her brother, she has no problem at all getting a job as a model for a big fashion house. And there she meets Agatha, and Agatha is admitted into the inner circle. And through Gerard, she meets Michael, who is also an orphan, as is Agatha. And Michael inherited a vast wealth. And so at this point is where Cocteau gets sort of just bored and skips everything for years. We re-meet the young people when they're in their 20s, and we find out that Elizabeth has married Michael, and like the day after her wedding has been widowed. Michael has died, I think, if I recall correctly, in a car accident. And so you're like, what? Last time we had these children not even leaving their house, but at least being visited by a few people. Well, yeah, okay, Elizabeth would go out to work, but she and her brother are still everything to each other. And they have what is called in capital letter, the room, and they are very into drama and theater. And when they're in the room together, they play something called the game, where each one tries to provoke the other in some creative way, to the extent that the other will dissolve into tears or a temper tantrum or something. So that's what they're up to in this room. Apparently, they're also up to incest. We don't see this explicitly, but we do know that they take baths together, and we know that both of them walk around nude and are often nude in the room. So the narrator is Gerard, and Gerard fills us in on these details, but he never explicitly says, yes, they are having sex together. Okay, so then, yeah, there's this big break in the novel, and then we resume with Elizabeth as a widow. Okay, so good and evil. Is this a moral tale? Is it good and evil? It involves incest. It involves the shocking neglect of children by their parents. But is it a moral tale? Is it evil, or is it just brokenness and ultimately tragedy? Okay, and we have other narratives where there are the deaths of children, where children being on their own is basically the cause of the deaths, or at least a contributor to it, to what is leading up to it. So in the case of this book, they're not children at the end of the book, but this just horrible neglect and exposure to their violent father and that sort of thing is, it's what's formed them. And when we do the turn of the screw, these are two little kids who likewise, before their governess arrives, have been sorely neglected and fallen under the sway of some evil people. In The Lord of the Flies, of course, these are not neglected children, but they end up being on their own on a desert island, and death ensues. So let's get down to the three very interesting deaths that we have in The Terrible Children. Well, the first person to die is the mother, whom Elizabeth is nursing, is the caregiver of, sacrificing her own childhood to that. The mother has, I believe it's a heart condition. She is clearly not going to be long for the world, and yet her death is a shock. And it is one of the most well-realized scenes in just a couple paragraphs of one of the most chilling and interesting death scenes in all of literature, certainly one that I'll always remember. And I've decided, actually, in this case, hopefully I don't fall afoul of copyright rules, but the writing is so intense and gorgeously rendered. This is the translation. I've read the book both in French first and then in English. The reason I bought the English edition is because it has Cocteau's own illustrations. And in fact, I've used one of those illustrations showing the death of Paul as the thumbnail for this video, which I hope is all right. And here is the description of the death of the mother. Paul has gotten the better of her in the game, and she's so upset that she decides to just sort of retreat and go to her mother's room and get some consolation there. And here's what she finds. And I'm quoting, "She found herself confronted by an unknown woman staring at her with wide open, tragic eyes and mouth. She now is the mother. She had been surprised by death, perpetuated in such a pose as death alone conceives of. Hands clenched, arms rigid along the chair arms. The doctor had foreseen that the end would come without warning, but the children alone, transfixed by this sudden counterfeit, this puppet in place of a live person, this stranger with the mask of a sculptured sage, gazed on it, livid, stone still, before its petrified stare, its cry of stone." So here's the first link to petrification in death, and this image will sort of become petrified. The children will never, this image will stay with them forever. And they're morbid enough that they kind of like it. They like that their mother had this sort of gruesome, dramatic kind of death, not that we see her actually die. And Cocteau talks about how they're able to split their image of their mother, on the one hand, as the living woman whom they did love, but on the other hand, as this, creepy, dramatic, right out of a horror movie kind of thing, image of her that they actually relish. These are not healthy kids. Okay, and then we come to a denouement. Now, whether or not their relationship is literally incestuous, Paul and Elizabeth are, joined at the hip, and Elizabeth finds out that Agatha, the model, is in love with Paul, and she also knows that Paul is in love with Agatha, and she just can't stand that idea. So Paul writes a love letter to Agatha, and Agatha is waiting breathlessly for the answer. And Elizabeth then goes and talks to them both separately. She tells Paul that Agatha is absolutely not in love with him, and she tells Agatha that Paul is absolutely not in love with her and is not going to write back to her. And both of them are just crushed by this. So this is the stage of the book where Elizabeth is a wealthy widow living in her ex-husband's mansion, I believe in the south of France. And so they're no longer in the apartment where they had their little room that they shared. Even though it was a big apartment, they shared a room by their own choice. And they are now living in this mansion, and Elizabeth does have her own room, but life in this house centers around Paul has, in this sort of grand salon, has taken screens and made a little room in the middle of the grand salon for himself, a little screened-in area, and it, like the room in the previous apartment, now becomes the center, the heart of the house where they all gather. In an earlier scene that's just brilliant, as much so as the death scenes, Paul had this boy, this really bad kid, the rebellious kid who was always in trouble at school. His name was D'Argelot, and Paul just madly admired him. And he finds out that, or Gerard finds out that D'Argelot is working. He has a nice, respectable job, but he still has this kind of criminal side to his personality. And his great passion in life is collecting poisons. He travels all over the world with his work, and he has this big collection of poisons. And so when Paul finds out about that, he marvels at it. He never re-sees D'Argelot, but Gerard tells D'Argelot about Paul, and Paul and D'Argelot gives a gift to Paul in the form of poison. And this poison, it's never said what it is. It's like this sort of black compressed substance in this black sphere or ball. And Paul is instantly mesmerized by it. He grabs it, or Elizabeth grabs it. They're all sitting around the dinner table, and Paul grabs it and starts running around the table, and his sister starts chasing him around the table, and it's such a cinematic scene. I can't wait to see it in the movie. So anyway, now we have the introduction of poison into the narrative. And after Paul's hopes are crushed, in his love for Agatha, whom he thinks doesn't love him, he eats this ball of poison. And Agatha is the first one to find him. She finds him dying. And here we have the description. Actually, this is pre-Agatha finding him. No, actually it's not. So she finds him, he's dying, and here's a description of the state he's in. Paul was still breathing. Since swallowing what D'Argelot had sent him, he had endured 4 hours of sensations so phenomenal that he had wondered intermittently whether the stuff was after all a drug, not poison, and if so, whether he had taken a sufficient dose to kill him. But now the worst of the ordeal was over. His limbs had ceased to exist. He was floating in space, had almost captured his old sense of well-being, but his saliva had entirely ceased to flow, and consequently his dry tongue rasped his throat like sandpaper. Except where all feeling had become extinct, his parched skin crawled unbearably. Oh, okay, so this is the exception to his feeling having become extinct. It sounds to me like this is some kind of central nervous system poison, although why he would have that euphoric state for 4 hours, I don't know of any. Well, I'm not a poison expert, but I don't know of any central nervous system poisons that would do that, as opposed just to immediately paralyzing your breathing. But anyway, I love this description because, you wonder if that's what it would be like. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Cocteau ingested something that had a similar effect without killing him, but it seems very realistic. Okay, so Elizabeth then appears on the scene. She's heard Agatha's screams for help, and Paul has found out and manages to let Agatha know, I can't remember how, that he really is in love with her. And he realizes, then she tells him that she's really in love with him. And so Elizabeth has been unmasked. And she has a gun with her. She has a revolver. I can't remember if the revolver was in the Grand Salon and she finds it and grabs it, or if she actually had it. And when she heard these cries from Agatha, had decided to bring it with her. But she is very unstable. She's very unstable. She loves drama. And here she is with a gun. So this is how Agatha sees her. A maniac in the act of disintegrating before her very eyes, standing before the mirror, grimacing, drooling, squinting, tearing her hair out by the roots. She was trying to resolve her inner tension by letting herself collapse, was struggling by means of this grotesque mime of imbecility to reduce life to its ultimate absurdity. Well, life is absurd in this narrative. It's absurd for Paul and Elizabeth, who have never been able to figure it out. It is for them just an absurdity. Okay, so she then manages to mesmerize Paul again. Instead of allowing Agatha to win, so to speak, at the end by Paul clinging to her, she manages to take Agatha's place and to be the one that Paul is fixated on. And she obviously doesn't want him to survive at this point. She doesn't want to risk the Agatha romance becoming real again. So she has a plan in mind. Courage, one little moment longer, and they will be where flesh dissolves, where souls embrace, where incest lurks no more. So this is not quoting her, but this is Cocteau telling us what she was telling Paul. They will be where flesh dissolves, where souls embrace, where incest lurks no more. So their souls will be joined, but not in an incestuous way. Okay, and here is the denouement with Elizabeth. He was sinking. He was ebbing out towards Elizabeth, towards the snow, the game, the room, their childhood. Still, by a single thread of light, the maiden goddess holds him out of darkness. His stone body is still penetrated by one last all-pervading thought of life. Still, his eyes held his sister, but she was nothing more than a tall shape without identity, calling his name. For still, her finger on the trigger, like one clasped with her lover in the act of love, Elizabeth watched and waited on his pleasure, cried out to him to hasten to his mortal spasm, to accompany her into the final moment of mutual rapture and possession, mutual death. Now he was spent, his head fell back. She thought the end had come, put the revolver to her temple, pulled the trigger. With a roaring din, one of the screens crashed on her as she fell. Okay, and he is not dead. So she anticipates it a little unknowingly. He will be dead within the next 5 minutes, but he has this bizarre experience of seeing the whole light and the windows where there's a blizzard outside and people looking down at him, Agatha and Gerard, and then he dies. Okay, so again, this idea of death as petrification. The body becomes fixed, the body becomes petrified. Meanwhile, his soul and Elizabeth's are going to join. And this is kind of a perversion of an idea that you have in, obviously, France is not an Orthodox country, but in Greek Orthodoxy, with going back to this philosophical idea in Greece of kenosis, of emptying out, and not emptying out in a nihilistic sense, but in a sense of emptying out and in turn being filled, emptying yourself out in love into the beloved, and in turn being filled with love in a kind of eternal dynamic state. Beautiful idea, but here with Paul and Elizabeth, of course, it's completely distorted. So anyway, I've talked enough about this. We're almost at a half an hour. I will just say that there's a movie that is loosely based on this book, but in a completely different setting in Britain in the 1960s, I think, and it's called The Cement Garden. And it is indeed about children who are suddenly orphaned, and the oldest brother and sister just being absolutely infatuated with each other. It's a good movie, a depressing movie. So next time, for sure, The Turn of the Screw, in a longer form than I had originally planned, since I've gotten more into the book now, and there's actually a lot to say about it. So much subtext in The Turn of the Screw. So yeah, but I doubt I'll go a half hour with it. But if you get a chance, despite having all these spoilers, believe me, it's still a book that you'll be able to immerse yourself in. So The Terrible Children, or Les Enfants Terribles by Jean Cocteau. And if you find the movie and you find a way to stream it, please let me know in the comments. All right, thanks so much for watching. Bye.